This is the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We chat about software development for mobile, HDTV, wearables, robotics, user experience, mentoring, and everything related to building products and services for the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. Your hosts today are myself, Eric Isaacson, UX engineer at 3Pillar Global, and Christian Smith, startup enthusiast and open source developer. Today we are joined with the one and only James Shore, Agile expert, author, and speaker. He's a TDD master, and he's going to be talking with us a lot about JavaScript testing, CSS testing, ways that you can do better on your testing, Agile, and how these all tie in together with our best practices. So, James, please introduce yourself to the listeners out there.
Yeah. I've been working with Agile for quite a while. I started out in 1999 doing feature-driven development, and then in 2000, one of the people on that team that we were doing feature-driven development on, they were really into the software community and participated in Ward's C2 wiki and had learned about extreme programming from that. And so that's how I heard about XP and Ward's wiki. And I investigated it, and I thought it was some of the weirdest, dumbest ideas I had ever heard. But they really intrigued me, and also I had a lot of respect for the people who were recommending them. So I tried it, and they are weird ideas, but they're not dumb because they worked. So I tried it in TDD on a small Perl web scraping project, and it worked really well. And I brought it back to the company, and we had a project use XP entirely. That worked really well. So we used it on a larger project, and that worked really well. And that pretty much hooked me. And I've been teaching and leading teams doing Agile development with an emphasis on XP with Scrum and Lean software and Lean startup for the last 14 years, I guess. As you know, I wrote a book called The Art of Agile Development, and I also have a screencast called Let's Code Test-Driven JavaScript at letscodejavascript.com, which is focused on, test-driven development and professional, rigorous JavaScript development.
I was recently introduced to it maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, and so I'm kind of a newbie on the block. But what really got me was Kent Beck's book. Mm-hmm. We did a book club where I was working at that time, and XP Explained was the book that we went through. So it's interesting you say that you focus on XP. The pair programming, too, was a new concept for me at that time.
Pair programming is definitely one of the ones that I looked at as like, this is so dumb.
Yeah, I said the same exact thing. And now it's like, I don't know what I would do without it, right?
Yeah. Once you've been pairing long enough, if you're working alone, it's like half your brain is missing. It's really quite an interesting difference in how much you can get done and think about when you're pairing versus when you're not.
Yeah, and Agile development, though, I mean, I've worked in Waterfall prior to that, and I found that Agile solves different problems. Did you find this as well? Like, what kinds of problems does it solve?
Well, I was really interested in software process for a long time. It goes way. I'm one of those guys that had a very geeky childhood and was fascinated by programming from an early age. And I had this experience when I was 16, I think. And because I was a geek, I was doing something that every geek programmer has to do. I was writing a D&D character generator.
Oh yeah.
In AppleSoft Basic on my Apple IIc, and I had what was a really a formative experience for me because I'm 16 years old. I think I know everything. Like I'm programming away, classes, races, all strength, dexterity, intelligence, all this stuff, and literally from one moment to the next, I don't know, maybe I had to go take a break or something, but literally from one moment to the next, I had it all in my head. And then nothing. Like I could not remember anything because AppleSoft Basic, you could use variables with as long of a name as you wanted, but only the first 2 letters mattered. So I had variables like CL $, CL string, AC string, and so forth. And subroutines in this language were all line number based. So you'd say go sub 10,000 or go sub 1,300 or whatever. So I had this all in my head about what all these different things meant and how they all fit together. And literally from one moment to the next, it disappeared. Like my brain completely went blank and I couldn't remember anything. And I wasn't very able to finish that program because I just lost the ability to understand it. And ever since that moment, I've been really interested in, how is it that software development works? How can it be done well? So I've always had an interest in software development, and I've completely forgotten your question. So
I asked what problems Agile solved.
Oh, right. So I was very
passion, though.
yeah. I was very interested in software process, and so before doing Agile, I was doing things by the book waterfall. Like I bought these big, thick books about how to do software right and how to do the stage gates and how do you do resource assignments and shape the resources so that everybody's in the right place at the right time. And I actually had the opportunity on a couple of projects to do it by the book in that sort of classic way. And it was an utter failure. The more by the book we did it, the worse it was. So I think I think the problems Agile solved for me was that I tried doing it the other way, by the book, and it didn't work. And so I was primed for something different. And so when we saw, feature-driven development and then XP, I was looking for something that was going to work, and I was just trying a bunch of different stuff. So it's not that it solved any specific problem, but that it actually worked, and nothing else had.
Yeah, for waterfall too, like, and other processes you may have used before as well. I mean, do you find that, because we don't build software typically, I mean, I guess we do, but like if you're in web development or something like that, you don't really package up something and send it out. There's not this idea of disks that you would ship out. It's all online. So do you think like the whole idea of how we build things has really shaped the Agile community in that respect?
Well, Agile came about before the web delivery was as big of a thing as it is now. And definitely for me, the first big XP project I did, it was a Java Swing application. This was back in 2000. So, in those days, people were sort of saying, well, it sure would be nice if you could ship at any moment because packaging up disks and mailing them out is expensive and prevent you from being Agile. But I don't think Agile came about because of that, but it certainly takes advantage of the flexibility and agility that being able to ship to a server rather than to customers makes. And that's where you see sort of the natural evolution of Agile, where we had continuous integration, and now people talk about continuous delivery. Because in this web-based environment, we have the ability to deliver at any moment. We can be more agile.
James, what led you to write a book about this? I mean, that's quite an undertaking. I've attempted writing a couple of books myself, and usually after a few months, you kind of start to fizzle out because I mean, it's more work than anybody ever expects it to. I'm curious, how did you get the bug to write the book, and how did you get to the stage of finishing it and getting it published?
Yeah, you're absolutely right about writing a book is something I would never recommend. It's certainly, at least in terms of the income you get from a book, it's certainly never going to be financially rewarding for the amount of time it takes. I spent 2 years on this book end to end, and I did work with a co-author, and that made the book better, but I wouldn't say it made it go faster. I spent 2 years on it, and that was nine of those months of that 2 years was full-time work. And it was really hard. And my daughter, my first child, was born right there near the end of it, which made it even more difficult. But for me, I was one of the early people doing Agile, I was doing XP before Agile was a term. I was one of the first people doing it really in practice for real. Maybe one of the first couple hundred people doing that. And I've always had sort of this natural inclination to talk about what I do, which is, that you see that in the screencast I've got as well. Or I like talking through how I approach things. So because of that, I've always, sort of been in the community talking about how Agile works and how I understand it. But I also do a lot of hands-on stuff. I'm a practitioner. So over the course of doing those things, I was learning more and more and more, and I needed to get it down on paper. Otherwise I'd forget it. So I wrote the book partly because I wanted to share what I had, but also because writing it let me open up my brain for new ideas. I was completely full, and I had to get it down so I could stop thinking about it all the time.
Yeah, the process of researching that is I mean, it's almost a great way to learn a subject, is to try to write a book about it.
Yeah.
And you sound like you were connected to some of the early people involved in Agile. You mentioned Ward Cunningham earlier. Actually, I've pair programmed with him on his Federated Wiki project a couple of times, and it's a hoot.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah.
We did the Fit project together. I paired with him to do the .NET version of the Fit project, which is now more popularly known as Fitness.
Can you tell us about that project a little bit?
Well, it's something that it didn't really work out in practice. It was a great idea, and I was really excited about it when I heard about it. Fit. So one of the ideas in Agile and in XP was, from the beginning, was the idea of functional tests. There was unit tests and functional tests, which now I would call end-to-end. Well, there's various types of functional tests, but the idea was that the customers would be responsible for having tests that told you when they were satisfied. So Fit was an attempt to bring customers into the conversation, not say, tell us what the software is supposed to do and then we'll prove we did it, but more help us understand what the software is about, help us understand the rules of your domain. Ward used to work at a company called Ycash, where they did sophisticated stock trading software. I don't know the details. And there he created this spreadsheet where this interface to spreadsheets where the stock analyst could type in their examples of how they expected the program to work, and the spreadsheet would hook into the actual Ycash software and tell them what it said. And they would use that to check to see whether or not it met their expectations. So Fit was an attempt to bring that to a more general case, but it didn't really work out. And what happened is more like what you see with Selenium and Cucumber. The tests were either handed off to a testing department or to the developers, and they became end-to-end tests. Let's talk about people logging in and doing stuff, and then this coming out of the back end, rather than being a real collaborative tool for conversations with the business folks about how their domain works. And because of that, I would say it wasn't a success, and we've actually stopped working on it because the idea was solid, but people just weren't picking it up in that way. I actually have a blog on my site. If you Google problems with acceptance testing, I believe is the name of it, you'll find me talking about why Fit didn't work out and what I recommend instead.
Well, it's good. At least you learned a lot to share with everybody on that.
Yeah. You know, I really wanted it to work, but it just didn't work out in practice. It turned out that the conversation with the customers at a whiteboard about what their expectations are was more valuable than embedding that information in a tool which wasn't a real programming language.
Yeah, I mean that brings us to a good point. Like you've done a lot of test-driven development with other teams and with your, for your own work. Can you talk a little bit about the value of TDD in general?
Well, I think the main value of TDD, which people often forget or miss, people often talk about test-driven development as a tool for ensuring correctness of code, which actually it can't do. What TDD can do is it can help the programmer be sure that the code he wrote does what he or she intended it to do. But there's more to correctness than the code doing what the programmer intended, because the programmer intentions can very easily be wrong. And you see this, I run across this, especially in JavaScript all the time, especially working in the UI and dealing with events. I intend to handle an event in a particular way, and I prove that I do it. But it turns out that event is not what's actually created by the browser in response to the user action I'm thinking of. So I can successfully TDD something and do exactly what I intended to, and the code's still wrong. So TDD is not so much about correctness, although there is a piece of that. There's also a piece of documentation. TDD acts as documentation. But I think the main value of TDD, the ultimate value, is that TDD gives you the ability to refactor your code. It provides a safety net so that when you make changes to your design, you can be confident that your code still works the way you intended it to. And if you have the ability to refactor your code, that's fundamental. That's how you prevent technical debt, is by constantly refactoring, by constantly making improvements. Without the ability to refactor, your code, gets heavier and heavier, bigger weight of technical debt, and eventually you do a rewrite, which is very expensive and kills products. Rewrites kill products because you spend a year or two reproducing what everybody already has, and nobody wants you to redo except you as a programmer. So refactoring and preventing rewrites is what TDD is all about, and I think that's something that people often forget or miss.
Yes, I started doing TDD with a little bit of Ruby, but right into JavaScript as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really interesting for me to see the differences between like different languages and different like working for the browser versus working for the server, and what you would do, the types of testing you would have. What is an integration testing? What is acceptance testing? Unit testing? These names change so much from place to place that I've seen, at least. Like I'll say to someone, "Hey, let's make an integration test for this," and the definition in their mind of what an integration test is may be the same or may be different than what I've seen. So with JavaScript, one of the problems I've seen is that typically people will test things that are like, they'll do giant mock objects, like that ultimately end up testing jQuery or some framework rather than testing their code. Is there some process that you use to figure out what am I really trying to test?
Yeah, mock objects, they're a really valuable tool. And there's a book about this called Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests that's written by, I believe it's written by Steve Freeman and Nat Price. And I haven't read it, but these are the folks who created mock objects, and this is sort of the quintessential book about mocking. And they have a particular style that they recommend strongly, and I know them well enough to trust that their judgment is good. And what I see in the field is a lot of people using mocking in a different way than I understand they recommend that it be done. What I see people doing is using mocking very heavily in all kinds of code bases. You see it in Ruby as well as JavaScript, and in all languages, actually, all non-functional languages. All languages other than functional languages. I don't know enough about functional to talk about that, but the way people tend to use mocks is to ignore design problems in their code. So test-driven development will expose issues in your design. If something is hard to test, that's a signal that there may be some overly tight coupling or cohesion problems in your code. But rather than responding to that and figuring out how to change the design, which can be a very challenging intellectual exercise, what people do is they paper over it by just stuffing in as many mocks as they can so that the thing they're testing is sort of surrounded by mocks, and they don't have to think about how it interfaces with the rest of the system or what the design issues are. But the net result of that is that your tests don't really test anything. All they do is test that you're calling various methods or functions, but there's not a lot of value in that, because you can look at the code and see that it calls those functions. And in fact, that approach to testing tends to be very brittle, and it tends to prevent or inhibit refactoring, which is ironically, defeating the main value of TDD as I understand it. So I do see what you're talking about with people overusing mocks. And I think the solution to that is, as an exercise, try not using mocks at all. And instead, whenever you run into a problem that you would want to solve with a mock, ask yourself, how could you change your design so that you wouldn't need a mock? And this, hopefully, this is a different way of thinking about things that will maybe open some eyes if people try it.
The other thing too is I would use I use Sign-On. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that library.
No, I'm not.
So Sign-On is basically the way I used it was for spies. So you would use
that.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Sign-On, the test double framework.
Yeah. So I mean, when I used that, I found that I ended up actually testing the functions that I was writing, I wasn't testing that they ran per se. I was testing more that, I expect, I assert this this object has mutated this way or something, and then for the complex, that really forces you to isolate these things into unit tests, right? So when you build these structures, you're using like a prototype object or something, and then each function would have its own, set of rules that you would test on. Do you find that works?
In general, I don't use sign-on, and I don't use spies or mocks. Often when I'm trying to figure out a problem, I might use a spy because I can't think of a better way, because it's easy. It's really easy to use a test double, but I see that as a problem, and I try to figure out a way to get rid of it. And usually I can. And you'll see this if you watch the screencast all the way through, you'll see this happen occasionally. The actual code I've got right now, I think there's maybe 2 or 3 spies in it that I just built by hand because there's so few and it was so easy. You can just build them by hand. So no, I don't use sign-on, and I try to avoid using tools like that.
You use mostly Karma, right, for a lot of the JavaScript?
Yeah, for actually doing the cross-browser testing, I use Karma plus Mocha. And I use expect.js when I need to support IE8 and Chai when I don't.
Yeah, I mean, as far as CSS testing too, I saw that you had videos on that, and you're probably the first person I've seen to have videos on that, even though I have heard about it before. And when I was working at a Ruby shop, I guess, we actually experimented with that using like here docs inside of an RSpec. And testing, just asserting like rule assertions that I expect that opacity will be 0.6, in this particular style sheet rule set. So there's other ways of testing that too, and I didn't get to see those videos because I have not purchased your subscription yet. But one of the things that I noticed, I know Facebook has Huxley, which is kind of like the it seems, at least I haven't used it, but like Phantom.js will run this testing as well, where it just does image diffs, right? So there's image diffs, there's linting, rule assertion, which we just went through. Are there others that you go through as well for CSS testing, and why would you even bother with CSS testing?
Well, the reason why I think is where to start with that. It's the same reason I do test-driven development anywhere else. I need to be able to refactor. I'm sure you've been in a situation where you're working on a fairly sophisticated app, a large app, with lots of different pages, where and you might have a base style sheet and then that modified in various pages as well. Those CSS style sheets get pretty crufty. And it gets to the point where if you make a change, you could easily break something without realizing it. I've had this happen even on the Let's Code site, which is pretty small. There's not that many pages on it, and yet when I make changes to the CSS, I break things without realizing it, which is embarrassing because this is a site about quality work, and people notice even more when I've done something dumb. I want the ability to refactor my CSS to be able to make changes to my CSS without breaking things. And the best way I know to do that is with test-driven development. So that's the why.
It seems, it really leads me to think that there is this thing. If people tend to have easier time understanding JavaScript because of the functionality, but the CSS is like, people think of it generally as visual, and I've been on teams where it's a large team and maybe there's a couple of front-end experts, but the back end there's not so much knowledge on CSS. So what you end up having is you're using some preprocessor, and then you have these giant rules that are overriding each other, and they're really long, and so the performance is bad, and so basically the code quality is so spaghettied of CSS that it's really hard to figure out how to test it. And using something like object-oriented CSS or BEM or some other way to do that does help. I would imagine that would help with testing as well.
Well, perhaps. I'm just getting started with the testing CSS journey, and it's very experimental still. But what you're talking about, that problem of the spaghetti CSS, is exactly the problem that I'm trying to solve. Because because if that CSS that you see, that spaghetti CSS, if it had tests, because testing doesn't prevent spaghetti code. I wish it did. People say it improves your design, but it doesn't. The only thing that improves design is people thinking carefully. And you can write crappy code using any technique, and people have proven it many times. But yeah, if that spaghetti CSS had tests on it and good tests that you trusted, you could refactor it to use OOCSS or to use a generator like SAS or less, and be confident that you hadn't broken it. So that's, and as new tools come along, or even as new rules are introduced or new styling rules are added to the language, and you phase out old browsers allowing you to use more sophisticated things, you want to be able to make changes to your CSS to support those. You need tests in place in order for you to do those refactorings. Change the CSS code without changing the visual effect, which is what refactoring is all about. It's about making changes that aren't visible to users.
I've been doing a lot of work with web components lately. And the shadow DOM has caused me lots of pain with JavaScript testing, and CSS as well. But not so much for the Polymer team. They seem to be doing a pretty good job with it. So I was looking at some of the tests that they've done. And so they're using Mocha and Chai, and they're doing these HTML tests to determine when the HTML loads, let's test these things after that. Have you experimented with any of these type of testing tools?
Well, I'm using Mocha and Chai. I'm not really familiar with Polymer. I tend to be I'm a bit of a technology laggard. I don't hop onto the latest thing, and that's partly because I'm trying to reflect what happens in a professional development environment where you have to support older browsers like IE8. So I haven't really been looking at web components at all, because those are still several years out, I would guess, before you can really practically use them in anything but a developer-focused site. So yeah, I haven't looked at that yet. Yeah, I think once IE8 goes away, IE9 never really is got less market share, as far as I can tell, than IE8 and IE10. So once IE8 finally goes away, which it's not too far away, we're getting close now. Finally, once it finally goes away, we can look at some of these more advanced things. But I tend to be very practical in what I'm doing.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I guess it's the same idea too with, I see a lot of the hardware stuff happening with the hardware movements, and there's a lot of the software getting put onto the motherboards themselves. So like Ruby, there's like an embedded Arduino, and JavaScript on Tessel, things like that. So yeah, maybe not tomorrow, but as far as I can see that there would be problems probably testing things across these type of interactions. So I have an application that runs software that depends on some robot moving its arm. How do I test to see if the robot moves its arm?
Yeah, that's an interesting and a challenging problem. You see that, I mean, for JavaScript, you've got that sort of problem just because of the nature of cross-browser development. And I really like Karma as a solution for that, because it allows you to do cross-browser development, and you can hook up real devices. So for my work, I do IE8 and a VM and IE9 and IE10 sometimes, as well as Firefox, Safari, Chrome, and also the iOS simulator. And sometimes I hook up an actual iPad, a real physical device to it as well, and run all the tests on all those devices simultaneously. For something like an embedded system where you're doing a browser, then you could do the same thing. For other situations where you've got embedded JavaScript, if you can run JavaScript on the device, you could potentially run tests on the device, and that is probably how I would do that. Although honestly, I'm not doing a lot of robotics with JavaScript, so
yeah, I'm not
I would
either,
have to see how it goes.
Definitely, it makes me think definitely how you would do that if I was going to.
I've found, so I've been doing test-driven development for 14 years, and I've actually found that there's not a whole lot of difference. Like the fundamental techniques and approaches you use, once you've seen it on enough devices and enough different languages, it sort of all comes together. There's really not that much difference. So when you're talking about a robot, I mean, the hard part tends to be, can I actually run code over here where it matters? And how hard is it to get that code over there and to get a tight feedback loop? But assuming you could get your code on the robot, the kinds of things you run into are the same kinds of things you'd run into anywhere. You've got the integration testing problem, which is that we don't want to have our tests all move the robot arm because that's really slow and it can be brittle. But we need some tests to test that we move the robot arm, and we need to have some way of knowing if we've done that correctly. So how do we do that? But there's also similar questions when you're talking about events in a browser, or when you're talking about talking to a database, or when you're talking about dealing with networks, with maybe a third-party system that you can't control. How do we know that we're stimulating that third-party service or API correctly without actually making a credit card charge? These are all really the same problems, and they have basically the same solutions, which are about how we design the code and how we create feedback and how we manually test where we can't get automated feedback.
James, I've been doing TDD for quite a while as well. In fact, I was doing it before I knew that it was called TDD. I would write a little function to call a function that I was working on to see what happened when I called it. And I'd build up a little collection of these things, and then I was in a bookstore and saw that, oh, this is TDD. There's a name for this. It was kind
absolutely.
of an enlightening moment that I stumbled onto doing something the right way without realizing that I was doing anything special. And so in the time that I've been writing tests along with my code, I've discovered there's a lot of interplay between the test suite itself and the code. And the way you write your code affects the way you write your tests and vice versa. Really quite an interplay. Ideas like mutability, especially if you try testing in different languages. For example, in Clojure, which is a functional Lisp variant, there's not as much emphasis on testing in that community because every time you call a function, it's going to do the right thing. You can't mutate state outside of the function like you can in a really object-oriented language like Ruby or JavaScript that has a big emphasis on mutability. And testing becomes a lot more important then. Do you see any really obvious big things about that interplay that you've discovered in your work?
Well, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head. The way you test is going to affect your code, and the way your production code is written is going to affect how you test. And I think the most important thing that I've noticed is that in the early days of TDD, people would say TDD automatically creates good design, and that unfortunately that was a little naive. I mean, these were people who knew what good design was and knew how to do it, and were able to learn from that experience of when it was harder to write the test. That told them something about how the production code was working that they needed to change. But people without that experience, and especially with the advent of a heavy misuse of mocks, as we talked about earlier, what people are doing is they're seeing that interplay between the code and the test, and they're just cutting it off by using mocks or another test double technique to say, well, our tests don't care what the production code looks like, and it's completely independent of what our design is, and that we're going to do it anyway. So yeah, I would say the biggest lesson is that they are meant to go together. Not such. I mean, you need to be able to refactor. If you can't change, if you change the design and that causes your test to break, you're doing something wrong. So they go together, but they shouldn't be so tightly coupled that you have to change tests when you change your production code, refactor your production code. But because of the way they fit into each other, I mean, really they're inverses, right? One, you're saying the code looks like this, and they're saying, yes, my code is like that. Because of the way they fit together, if your code is poorly designed, your tests will tell you. And if your tests are poorly designed, for example, using mocks overly heavily, it will affect the way your design looks. You will be able to get away with all kinds of crap. The trick, though, is having enough design experience and paying enough attention to that pain to fix the design rather than paper over the pain by using increasingly crafty hacks in terms of lots of test doubles, lots of dependency injection, frameworky stuff that's not actually adding to your application.
Now, is that somewhat related to that fifth value that Bob Martin, aka Uncle Bob, proposed for the Agile Manifesto? He called it what was it? Craftsmanship over crap.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. The Agile community started out being very developer heavy, very grassroots. The early Agile conferences were pretty much entirely populated by programmers, and people, said we need to bring in more people. Agile is about cross-functional collaboration. We need to bring in more people than programmers, and there was a real push to bring in project management and product management and executives, and it succeeded. We got a lot, especially for project managers and project managers who have the title of Scrum Master, people who don't have coding experience but are sort of in a processy role. But what happened was that, combined with some of the other sort of the fadification of Agile became kind of a fad, and so a lot of people jumped into it because there was money to be made. Those two things together sort of swung the pendulum way too far in the direction of people not knowing how to program, having a huge voice in the community. And I think the craftsmanship movement was a backlash against that. And I think I agree with the idea, but I don't agree with the sort of us versus them that has come out of it. The brilliance and the strength of Agile from the beginning has been that it is a cross-functional big tent approach. We want to include everybody who's involved in producing great software. And craftsmanship is saying, well, let's just talk about programming. So I agree. Quality code does matter, and it's really important that we have quality code. I would just like to see that as part of the Agile conversation, not as separate from it. And as a fifth value in the manifesto, well, Bob has a talent for provocative statements, and craftsmanship over craft is a provocative statement. But the original manifesto, there's value in both things. Individuals interactions over processes and tools. There's value in processes and tools, and there's value in individuals and interactions. And we pay more attention to individuals and interactions, but we don't ignore processes and tools. So craftsmanship over crap doesn't work because there's no value in crap. I agree with the sentiment. We need quality code, but I don't think you need to tell programmers that. Programmers know that. Sometimes they don't know how to do it, which is a whole nother conversation. And sometimes they don't think they have permission to do it, which again is another conversation that I'm very happy to have. But
which it kind of brings to mind Zed Shaw's website. I don't think I can even say the name of it on here. Speaking of provocative, it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek, criticism of some of the proponents of Agile and their motivations. I think they were saying things like, we value individuals and interactions, but they really value billable hours, right? And so, how much of the community, you said that we brought in other people besides programmers, but how much of the Agile community do you think really misses the point and focuses on the wrong things?
So Zed Shaw does have a talent for being provocative. And I actually, there's sort of this anti-Agile backlash that says, well, all I need to do is get 10 smart people in a room or 5 smart people in a room and do good work. That's actually an Agile process. It's called crystal clear, which is basically get smart people in a room and let them decide how to do the work. And it's a fairly small method. It's created by Alistair Coburn as part of a larger suite of ideas, which basically says that when you don't have something that's life critical or necessarily, major business critical, and you can hire good people that know what they're doing already, then yeah, absolutely you can do that. The problem with those ideas is that once you get into larger or more difficult problems, or you want to hire people other than Zed Shaw.
Who would want to do that?
I'm not going to answer that question. But yeah, it's these ideas in Agile have been around for a long time, and some of them have been developed further by the Agile folks, and some of them are just restatements of stuff we always knew to be good. Ultimately, Agile is about taking what we know works and popularizing it. So the idea that we shouldn't do Agile because we already know everything is great if you already know everything, but I would bet that the most people who think they already know everything don't. That if they would open their minds, they would have opportunity to learn new ideas and new things. That said, I think the backlash against the over-process centric stuff that you're starting to see that has come up due to the more and more bottom feeders coming into the Agile community, I think that's real, and I think I understand that backlash. It makes me sad to see the good ideas that we started with taken down at the same time.
Yeah, I've been in that situation where I've been at a place that they've heard the word Agile, and now they're going to just, let's do it, right? And they don't understand it. So what happens is they think it's awesome, but they're not really doing what they need to do to get these results that they want to get. Mm-hmm. So like, for instance, I'll give you one example in the TDD, right, that we were talking about. It's like, okay, let's just, every time you code, you have to do tests for this. You have to test. And mm-hmm. then what happens is, because if the culture is like, well, just get it done, but, oh, by the way, do tests also. It turns into, I just have to do the test and push it away, and then you end up with crap tests, like 1,000 that take forever to run but have no purpose. And that's not with everybody. I'm just saying, like, there is that pressure based on the company culture. And because the culture has said, okay, we're going to try this new thing, but we're not willing to make the change full-fledged and full heart in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've definitely seen that. In fact, Diana Larson and I have been talking about this for years, and we actually created something called the Agile Fluency Model, which you can find at agilefluency.com, which it's a white paper, so it will redirect you to an article we posted on Martin Fowler's website. But the short link is agilefluency.com. And basically we're saying, yeah, there are a lot of different ways of understanding Agile, and people tend to come into it, sort of a shallow perspective. But look at all these other things that you could consider when you're talking about Agile. You could take it at a very sort of shallow level and just do stand-ups and sprints and then go home and stop there. Or you could look deeper and you could look at, well, how do we not just understand how to create software that the business cares about, which is what we call 1-star, but how do we deliver that reliably and as frequently as the market will accept it, consistently and sustainably? Then that's what we call 2-star. And how can we also make sure that we're doing that in a way where we're optimizing and maximizing the value we create? So we're experimenting in the market and understanding what the market wants and producing what the market really cares about. And that's what we call 3-star. And then how can we do that in an organization with several products so that we're sharing information and wisdom about what many products need and what several markets need and what this company strategy should be overall? And that's 4-star. So there's a lot more to Agile than people think. They hear the word Agile and they think they know everything without even reading anything about it. But there's a lot more to it than that. And that's actually what our Agile Fluency Model is trying to help with, is trying to help share that there's more here than you might think, and here's some criteria to consider. And if you're not seeing these things yet, then maybe there's more learning to do.
So like in Agile, I did read that you had talked about doing spikes in Agile. And my only experience with spikes has been at one company, and typically it was like, okay, we're going to have a spike for this because we don't know anything about it, and it would be a development effort of maybe half a day to 2 days. There's no like exact time limit, just an estimate, that we would do. And we'd go and do it, and then when that was done, what was the expected outcome was not really clear. And then we'd code, and then maybe these things were not flushed out well. So can you explain what a spike is and how you would use it to gain further knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. A spike is simply any experiment that you plan to throw away that you're going to use to learn about a technology. As an example, when I started doing test-driven development of iOS touch actions, I had not done any touch interaction in JavaScript before. So I wrote a little standalone, a little throwaway program that would take touches and print out information on the screen about what I was seeing, and also would generate touches so I could do that in testing and draw some lines on the screen, which is what my app was trying to do, just so I could see how it all worked out. And then once I'd figured that out, I threw it away and I redid it using that understanding to help me write good, solid code. And you can do that as a standalone program. You can do it in your test. You can do it in your existing code and then revert it. It's just any throwaway code that you're using to learn how to do something.
Very cool.
So everybody listening to this has probably done a spike before. They just didn't call it that. It's just, anytime you take a moment to research something by doing it rather than reading about it.
And as far as like customer collaboration goes, that's really important for me at least, and I know for Christian as well, where you're constantly interacting to gain quicker feedback and to share design, right? Mm-hmm. So as far as like in agile development, in practice though, it can be difficult to achieve this with times, like where, let's say the people you need to interact with are not available for certain times. And so there's a lot of logistics, I guess. What are the obstacles that you find in that, or the ways to get around those? Like, how do you get past them?
Yeah. This collaboration is, of course, central to Agile, the idea that we're going to work closely with our customers, or at least our product management if you're producing commercial software rather than internal software. We're going to work closely with the people who understand what we need to build so that we build the right thing. And it's really central, and I think it's one of the things that teams actually tend to struggle the most with, or have the most trouble getting. It's very easy from a how do you do it perspective, and very hard from a social and political perspective within an organization. And that Agile fluency model we talked about, that's sort of what distinguishes you from stopping at 2-star, which is fine, or getting to 3-star where you're really delivering the right thing to market. And how do you do that? Just a lot of work on building trust that people aren't going to be wasting their time by spending a lot of time with you. Because there's a lot of misunderstanding of how software development works, and a lot of bad experiences by non-developers from their perspective. It's always it's very hard to understand why this stuff takes so long, and a lot of non-developers have had an experience of working with a development team who was very dismissive to their desires, very disrespectful of their time, and then ended up shipping them something or giving them something that completely misunderstood what they wanted. So it's just a matter of being persistent and really working to rebuild that trust, which a lot of teams have destroyed without even realizing it.
That's a really great point. If you're being dismissive, like you're saying, everyone has really good ideas they bring to the table, and if you're working in a true Agile environment, and my limited experience has been that everyone will welcome those ideas and be open to it and understand that not everyone thinks the way they do, and not everyone has priorities that are their priorities, but you're all working together for a similar goal.
Yeah. And another piece of it is really being respectful of the time those folks are putting in, and not asking them to do stuff that they don't need to do. Don't assume that, they're there to serve you. Instead, think of it the other way. If we were in a retail shop, would we tell our customers, yeah, we've got any jersey you want, just come over here with the scissors and start cutting? Oh, and we won't help you unless you pick up the scissors. Yeah, we'll actually build it for you, but you need to pick up those scissors, otherwise get out. And that's sort of the attitude that some teams have towards their customers. We want you to put in a huge amount of time and effort so we can do the work for you. Yeah. So there are things that the customers really need to do, but there's some things we ask them to do that they don't need to do, and we should be more respectful of their time.
To gain that trust, like you were talking about, is always a challenge, I find. because in a lot of situations I've been in with other companies, it's been where you have to work at that trust really hard, and then over time it'll blossom because they'll see what value you bring to them. But getting that early on is very difficult, and it makes it difficult to ship out quick early. Once you've established that trust, if you're going back to a client you've had before, it's much faster, I've found.
Yeah.
How do you handle getting stuff out quicker and establishing that trust earlier?
Well, I think it's a process you have to go through, and it's, I think, just coming to it from the perspective of we are here to serve you, and being very, very, not necessarily deferential. I'm not talking about prostrating yourself to folks, but cutting back on the arrogance and really coming at it from a perspective of how can I help you, and how can I help you understand how we can best work together without being arrogant about it. I think is the key, and it just takes time. It really does. It doesn't happen overnight because people have had a lot of bad experiences with arrogant teams that produce bad stuff.
James, I've got a question for you, not to change the subject here, but I've been looking over your Let's Code JavaScript website, and I noticed that you had that thing backed by a Kickstarter campaign.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Could you tell us something about that? How did you start that off, and how did it go for you?
Well, it went really well. It was a great experience, and I would definitely do it again. So before I did the Let's Code JavaScript site, I had a series called Let's Play TDD, which I ran for a couple of years, and you can still find it if you Google Let's Play TDD. You'll find it on my regular website, which is jamesshore.com. And I produced 200 and something episodes of doing test-driven development in Swing and Java. And originally it was just an experiment. I just wanted to do something, I wanted to show people what TDD was like for real, to try to get around some of these issues I was seeing with both with mock objects and not taking small steps and not using it for refactoring. And it went pretty well. It was very well received. It wasn't the most relevant of technologies, though. Swing and Java was definitely not super relevant. So after a while, I thought, what would happen if we tried to do this in something that was very relevant? What would happen if we made this about web development and JavaScript rather than about Java and Swing? So I posted to Twitter and got a positive reaction. So I blogged about it and asked people to take a survey and got a positive reaction. And so this is basically lean startup, right? I'm testing the market with increasingly costly tests. And that went well enough that I decided to do a Kickstarter, which was a huge amount of work, a surprising amount of work, and got a lot of response and led me to not only produce the episodes I promised for the Kickstarter, but actually commercialize it as the Let's Code JavaScript site that's out today.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's a good looking project. And I saw you had quite a lot of backers.
Yeah, I think we had about 900 backers or something like that.
Yeah, it's a good long list. So would you have any suggestions, things that you would do differently or that you could have done better or that really made it work for you, for anyone that might want to do something to promote a project like this?
Yeah, I think the key to a successful Kickstarter is having an audience already built. Don't go into a Kickstarter expecting that will create the audience. What you want to do is make sure you've got people who want what you're thinking of building before you do the Kickstarter. The Kickstarter is a way of making sure that interest, which sometimes people express interest but not be willing to pay for something. So the Kickstarter will be a way of validating that and actually making the thing happen. But before you go into it, you need to build that audience. You need to make sure that people really want what you're doing. And one way to do that is to create good stuff like I did with Let's Play TDD, give it away and see if people like it. And then if they do, then you can take that and do something more with it. The other thing that was really important was just I got lucky. The site was posted to Hacker News, or the Kickstarter was posted to Hacker News fairly early on, got a good response there, which led to additional publicity from JS Weekly and other sites, which was sort of a self-perpetuating success. I think if I hadn't gotten that early hit, it may not have actually turned out as well as it did.
So going back to Agile for a second, this is probably one of the last questions I have here today that I can think of at the moment.
Sure.
But we've been with Agile, we've been living with it for quite a while now. And some of these ideas go back 20 years or so. Recently, I've been seeing the term post-Agile here and there, particularly with the idea of programmer anarchy and things like that. Where do you see Agile going from here, from where it is today?
I really think so. I think that I don't know much about the post-Agile movement. I do see this trend of people feeling like they already know everything and thus they're just automatically Agile. That doesn't feel like a step forward to me. That feels like Zed Shaw's, programming. Maybe you do know everything, but if you haven't actually tried the thing that you think you already know, you don't know it. Expertise takes experience and knowledge. And if you lack the experience component, then you really don't know it. So I don't know about that, but I've been hearing that ever since Agile became a term, which is, people saying, well, I've always done this without really understanding it. I do think that the real direction of Agile is something that we tried to put in our Agile fluency model. The ideas of, or the philosophies of Agile are about self-organization, about collaboration, about creating good work that's sustainable. And we know a lot about how to do that technically, and we even know a lot about how to do that at the single team level. I think there's still a lot to be learned about how to create a truly Agile organization which has multiple interdependent or interworking teams. And this is something where I think there's a lot of opportunity still. A lot of people talking about scaling Agile don't really do single team Agile well, so I don't expect them to do a good job of multi-team Agile. But the Agile organization, I think, is what's next for those folks who like to be on the cutting edge. But for most people, just getting to the point of delivering quality software reliably on the market cadence is still the next thing to learn how to do. And from there, learning how to really understand the market and take responsibility for building great software that is worth, produces good revenue or whatever else you need, and having that sort of ability in a team. Those are things that we already understand Agile's about, but 95% of teams don't do it yet. So there's still a lot of just learning how to do what we know well before we worry too much about what's next. But I do think what's next is multiple teams setting direction collaboratively for a company. That's the possible future that I think we have a lot to learn about.
Do you think that we can expect Agile to keep going, or will something else come along? As far as, because you look back, waterfall worked for a long time, right? And then we had new ideas and things changed.
This has been pretty wide-ranging discussion. We never really finished talking about how TDD CSS would work, but maybe people can come look at my site if they want to learn more about that.
Because you have 2 free hours of screencasts on your site. And I was all excited. I'm like clicking on the CSS one. I'm like, oh no, it's premium only.
Sorry about that. Well, here's a secret for you and everybody listening. All the code I produce on that show is on GitHub, and you are welcome to look at the code. Although I do think that it's a good idea to listen to the screencast because it's real development, right? And real development means you're making trade-offs, and you never have a perfect decision. I'm not doing hypothetical code. I'm doing real development. But you can look at the code. It's at GitHub/JamesShore/Let's Code JavaScript. It's in my list of repositories. So you can find some of the CSS stuff there too.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming in today and talking with us, or not coming in, but calling in.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to share or promote before we end the episode?
No, just if you're interested in test-driven JavaScript, please do check out my site. It's letscodejavascript.com. And if you're interested in sort of the bigger ideas of what is Agile and how do you get good at it and where could it possibly go, the white paper Diana and I wrote at agilefluency.com might be of interest to you. And we have some materials in there that you can use in your own presentations that are licensed for free use. So check that out as well.
And for people who want to contact you or contact Agile Fluency, do you have Twitter handles, or you have GitHub, or not GitHub, Google Plus or something?
Yeah, my Twitter is @JamesShore, and people are welcome to email me at jshore@jamesshore. I blog on the Let's Code JavaScript site at blog.letscodejavascript.com, and I also blog on my own site, which is jamesshore.com. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
This episode comes to you, at least in part, through the support and sound equipment generously supplied by 3 Pillar Global. 3 Pillar is a software product development company in Fairfax, Virginia, and 3 Pillar is a leader in creating purposeful and innovative product experiences. 3 Pillar was recently named to the Washington Post Top Workplaces list for 2014. So if you want to follow 3 Pillar on the Twitters, it's @3PillarGlobal. And to find out more and see current job openings, please visit 3pillarglobal.com. That's 3 the number, pillarglobal.com. Thank you.